All right, well, I think this is a good time to start. I want to just welcome everyone here to a Canadian Patriot review presentation. We're taking a little break from our usual weekly Rising Tide Foundation presentations, since the world situation just demands it, I think. And I think everyone here has been at the edge of their seat, trying to keep abreast of the world strategic great game. And obviously, we are living right now in a very interesting, I guess is one word we can use for this moment in history. It's a period of great turbulence, a lot of danger, a lot of potential. And this is the consequence of many, many years of tolerating wrong ideas, foolish ideas, lies, which might seem to benefit those who carry out or tolerate the lies for a period. But I think as we've all come to realize, the universe doesn't tolerate stupidity forever. And there is certain boundary conditions that we imposed on ourselves when we made certain decisions generations ago to turn away from a certain way of thinking about the nature of government, the nature of humankind, the nature of God, that was seen in some of the best statecraft we saw coming out of Western statesmen like John F. Kennedy, his brother, Martin Luther King, many, many others throughout the 60s who resisted a very misanthropic paradigm shift. These were people who were trying to fight for a more optimistic, positive view of the nature of human beings. Oh, I'm just going to hit mute.
55 this time.
There we go. Done. So by agreeing, acquiescing to turn away from that, we put ourselves on a new trajectory, new path, which created, I think, the crisis that we are now seeing unfolding all over the world currently. It's difficult sometimes to keep abreast with all of the information overload, the crisis in Ukraine obviously being a reflection of something much more global, the breakdown of the system, the questions of the things like Great Reset, which people hadn't even heard about, things like the World Economic Forum or Klaus Schwab. I know I didn't. A couple of years ago, this was not on my radar. All of a sudden, people, I think many people around the world have had a certain awakening. And Joaquin Flores is somebody who I have worked with, I've been friends with for some years now, and has earned the greatest respect from me and everybody who he comes into contact with. I think quickly realized that there's just something particular about how he looks at the world, which has high value. And I mean, Joaquin has been the curator of a wonderful Telegram channel. I think the best Telegram channel that covers breaking events from a holistic standpoint with a good analysis, which is in the chat box. It's also going to be in the description of this video. He's the editor-in-chief of Fort Russ, a news magazine online, which is now unfortunately very difficult to come by if you're in Canada or other parts of the West, and as well as a leading member of the Center for Syncretic Studies. Joaquin, I'm not going to say anything more. I know you have a few remarks to say, and we're going to field questions. This is hopefully going to be a very lively back and forth. So if everybody can put their names in the chat box, I'll call on you in queue. If you would like me, as I pointed out, if you would like me to read aloud your question for you, make it short and concise as much as possible. And otherwise, Joaquin, the stage is yours.
Yeah, Matt, I want to thank you for hosting this event and for the beautiful introduction. I hope I can live up to it. The pleasure is all mine to be here with all of you today. We have a full house and growing. And, you know, this is really an emergency session because we are on the precipice potentially of thermonuclear warfare. And it is not too often that this happens. Some of us, not myself, but some of us lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we are very close to that type of scenario right now. And I think that in your introduction that you really laid it out so well. I would paraphrase it in such a way like when governments and governance and the leading ideas in the world so vastly depart from fundamental principles that have guided both the Enlightenment and human endeavors for thousands of years, that's when we face this type of crisis. We have diverted so far from the types of ideas that have made human civilizations possible for time immemorial. And I think that is really the question. How do we restore that? And I don't have answers for that. And I think that all of us are searchers and all of us have perspectives and angles that are valid. The idea, of course, is to build as broad a conversation as possible with people from all walks of life who come from many different religious and ideological backgrounds, and to see where these things really fit together. Because I am convinced, and I think you will find too, that people, though we speak different languages, theology, political, that when we search after truth and what is right and what is good, what is true and what is beautiful in the world, we can actually find that many of the differences that we thought we had aren't really there. I furthermore believe that there are many corporate and some governmental institutions, many governmental institutions, which seek to confuse language and divide us in ways, and would like to set people against each other over these types of misperceptions. So they actually promote misperceptions by confusing each other, and they manipulate that, unfortunately. And I don't believe that I'm cynical for saying that. I believe that I'm skeptical of their cynicism, and I want to approach it on that level with that tone. We have how I would like to do this is to work through questions where we know very much about. People talk about world strategy, the title of our forum, Ukraine World Strategy and the Great Reset. And what I would like in being able to help with questions is to remember that in asking your questions, to try to include as little affirmative statements as possible, as little statements which, you know, if the premise of the question is built into something that is a firmly held belief, then I might not be able to answer the question in a way that sheds light on your real question. So that I would just ask that consideration, so that when I answer questions, I'm not untangling or you know, reframing a question. Other than that, there are no such thing as bad questions except for those. And then I would say in confusing how people think about things, one of the things I've noticed, and one of the dangers that has led to this collision course, has been, and I said this earlier today, a generation that for whatever reason grew up in a culture where euphemisms or synonyms somehow changed the meaning, when for thousands of years people knew that euphemisms or synonyms didn't change the meaning. And we have experienced that with everything in life, from an insurance claim to how a new law gets worded, what they call loopholes, and things like this. And that may seem at first like an abstraction, and how is that the issue? But when you understand how we can call the elites by many different names, and they might kind of come from our own backgrounds. We might call them the ruling class, the elites, the oligarchy, you know, whatever, the plutocracy. It's all the same, and I won't use those terms too precisely to be, you know, as inclusive as possible. I'll use those, you know, words to mean the same thing generally. So when we look at the crisis, for example, in Ukraine, a lot of doublespeak and synonyms were used to take things in the wrong direction. And there are a lot of misperceptions, of course, about what's going on. And of course, the color revolution that occurred in 2014 that led to this crisis, and also ignoring people, institutional thinkers like John Mersheimer, who we will discuss a little bit, who's not a perfect thinker because no one is, and his warnings or his analysis really contained a double-edged sword. So this double-edged sword, of course, is this, and this is really, we're really talking about a problem that could end the world within weeks if cooler heads don't prevail. Although I suspect they will, I've been wrong before, and I don't want to be wrong about this. And with John Mersheimer, who is the premier leading thinker in international relations, whose ideas have shaped, either through listening to what he has to say or listening to what he has to say and disregarding it, his ideas have shaped US foreign policy for over a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades. And he's the one who explained the very simple formula that if the North Atlantic Treaty Organization keeps expanding into the former Warsaw Bloc countries and former Soviet Union countries, that it would force the hand of Russia to respond with whatever assets that they have. And another interesting component of that, it has been a dangerous trope in particularly American culture. I can speak as an American. I'm from Los Angeles, California originally. I live now in Belgrade, Serbia, former Yugoslavia. And what I remember growing up was this promoting of the idea of the invincible American army. And then after the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, we kept talking about how bad and old and rusted and degraded the Russian military was. And while if that belief were pervasive, and if it led NATO countries to tone down the up-arming and to spend those military industrial complex dollars in a different way, like investing, like having the Army Corps of Engineers build roads and train rail, and to integrate economically throughout North America and to connect Alaska to Siberia, all of these would have been much better ways to spend the same military industrial complex dollars. I mean, these are rational, sane solutions that don't require even the regular players taking a hit. That's what's so astoundingly frustrating about the way that this has happened. What do I mean by that? And I will take questions very, very soon. This is just my introductory remarks. What do I mean by that? Well, all of these military industrial complex companies, most of these technologies and the supply chains and the upstream and downstream economy, which really hundreds of thousands, maybe more millions of jobs depend upon when you really break it down, these didn't have to go away. They just had to be redirected towards infrastructural development. That's what's so amazing about this. Now, instead, what happened is, instead of taking this idea that the Russian military was degraded because they have rusting plane wings and their nukes don't even fire, that they're all duds, all their missiles are duds and expired and stuff, and their bullets are bad, and all that snow made them damp. If that had led to de-escalation, that would have been great. But what in fact it's led to is it's contributed to a dangerous neo-Nazi subculture on the internet, in a lot of different forums, different Chan type sites and Reddit, of course. And there's a generation of young people born in the 90s and aughts that and oddies, as I guess as they call it, that actually believe that that number one, that the Third Reich could have won and should have won, and number two, that the Russian army today is in weaker condition than the Russian army of World War II. And so that explains a lot of the culture of going over as volunteers on the neo-Nazi side into Ukraine that maybe you've heard about. Some of you have maybe read about these. Some of them are soldiers of fortune, but others are very much ideological, super far right neo-Nazis that are engaged in this kind of stuff and signing up to be involved in this ethnic cleansing campaign of ethnic Russians and others, Tatars eventually, of course, and so on. So that is one of the crises. And then the destruction of language and the violation of fundamental principles has led to that. And playing word games and using dishonest approaches in statecraft and diplomacy. This is, I can't underscore this enough. Of course, games have always existed, but for example, the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, as early as 2015, said that the United States had become non-agreement capable. So when we look at what happened that led to this war right now, there was a conflict that began after the Obama government and his second most important person in the State Department, who was the head of the Europe and Eurasia foreign policy, Victoria Nuland, worked with the finances provided through this vast network of publicly declared and easily Googleable, in fact, NGOs. These are not, this is not a secret, is the amazing thing. All of this is right. This is a crime done in broad daylight. And they spent over $4 billion of public taxpayer money to overthrow the government in Ukraine in 2014, and then other, countless billions, first of all, over the years from the 90s onwards through USAID, the National Endowment of Democracy, and so forth. And then later with the NGOs operating, and it was probably more than $500 to $1 billion through these, we call it Soros to give an idea. There's different players involved. Soros is a big one. It's a heuristic or shorthand approach of describing this nonprofit industrial complex, which absolutely Soros is probably the main player, no doubt, but it's bigger than Soros. This isn't to say that Russia is a perfect country or that war is a good thing. Rather, we're looking at how all of these actions that were taken were known would eventually either their plan was to create such military situation for them that maybe top generals would break ranks and say, we don't want to get into this war. And once that had happened, it would put the elites of the country, the financial elites in the country, in a position to want to overthrow the government by working with who would be their Western colleagues to have massive demonstrations in big cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, where you would have hundreds of thousands of people in the street to simulate popular support for something which maybe 5% of the city really was motivated enough to support in the streets, or less, 1%. And really, in a country of 140 something million people, really just not even a fraction, less than a fraction of 1% of people. But if you can mobilize them out all on the street, and we're talking about how the color revolution scheme works, if you haven't picked up on that, if they can then use media, mass media, to tell a story, and then have military and elites collude to overthrow the Russian government, their plan was to break Russia up into an additional 10 or dozen more countries. This is not a conspiracy. This is also openly published because the Atlantic Council, working through Columbia University, provides a multi-million-dollar a year grant project for university students in former Soviet Central Asia and Eastern Europe, where they write an essay contest to get a master doctoral degree track financed to write about the different ways that Russia could be broken up. And not just the names of those. Each essay is very unique, and it shows a lot of brilliance and understanding of the cultural, ethnic, historical differences within Russia. And that really actually proves something, because it's important. Let me back up and say this. We are in such a situation where the question has become so polarized. Everyone has heard very bad things about Russia, and I'm sure that some of those are true. But because there's so much access to those things about Russia that are out there that you can find and evaluate for yourself, it may sound that I'm a cheerleader for a country that I'm not from and don't live in, and that's not the case. It's simply, this is information that might not be out there. And so because the question is so polarized, by pointing out all the things that aren't true, it may sound like an apology or making excuses or defending things, when really I'm trying to just speak as neutrally and uncharged and objectively as a person can. And we're all, of course, subjective in that sense. So when so John Mersheimer, we were discussing, he projected that this would end in a catastrophe of one kind or other, and his ideas were not ignored. And in many ways, what he said was a double-edged sword, because even though he warned about encroachment, he also believed that
you have to go pee, Rose.
He also believed that what would happen if Russia went into Ukraine is that they would encounter a quagmire. And everyone has known that is a view in the, or a hope in the establishment. And I will call them a globalist establishment. There's so many words to call them, but again, we said the Western oligarchy, the Western ruling class. They believe that it would be a quagmire, or they promoted the view that they thought it would be a quagmire. And in many ways, unfortunately, John Mersheimer's ideas also then allowed them to be emboldened, because even though he warned that Russia would react, he also assessed, and I believe wrongly, that it would create a quagmire. And so that narrative, because the Russian strategy in Ukraine involves certain strategic aims that take a certain amount of time to accomplish, there's been a quick decision in the Western media to call this a quagmire when we're 30 days in, 32 days in. That's not a quagmire. When you look at, for example, and this is an opinion based on informed review of the last conflict that Russia was involved in, was only recently in Syria, and they were invited by the Syrian government to eliminate the Barack Obama and John McCain project known as ISIS. And of course, they had a much less ability to project force than the Ukrainian military in some regards, and in other areas they had some superiority over Ukrainian military. So that's a draw. But when you look at how long that their campaign took, it wasn't over in 90 days or 100 days. And the resources that have been poured into war in our lifetimes have been so immense that when these things break out, you're talking about decades of weapons and planning that have been stored up to go into these. So they're not resolved in 30 days or in 60 days, and probably not in 90 days, if that answers questions about how long this conflict may go. So with that, I will conclude to go to the questions, to say that the fact that there have been these plans to break Russia up along all these ethnic lines also underscores something, that Russia, not only in fact, but by its constitution, is a multinational country. And they bring together, and not perfectly, but pretty darn good. They bring together a lot of different peoples that live across 9 different time zones, that have a shared history going back between 400 and 1,000 years. And these are people that have worked together at times and had problems at times, and even wars at times. And so now, but this shows that, in fact, Russia is a multinational state, with a lot of respect and representation for all the different peoples. It's composed of multinational peoples of Russia, and they're all Russian. And there is such a thing as Russian extreme nationalism, and they are kept so far away from government and from they're kept so far away from academia, diplomacy, from government, from anything respectable in Russian society, because they are ultranationalists. And their view of a Russia is a smaller Russia, because in fact they are supported by the Western aristocracy as part of this plan to divide Russia up into 10 or 12 more countries, you see? And so Russia rejects the idea of an ethno-nationalist state. I say this in particular because just today or yesterday, the Washington Post, that's Jeff Bezos' billionaire blog, Washington Post, published yet another insane article that's going to misinform, the 50 or 100 people that still read the Washington Post, who mostly are Democrats. Nevertheless, they say outright that Putin is justifying what they're doing in Ukraine based on ideas of blood and an ethno-nationalist state, blood, land, and an ethno-nationalist state. They're trying to make it sound like Lebensraum and blood and soil, which we know were the rallying cries of Adolf Hitler's Germany. In fact, what Ukraine has done slowly over the past 18 years is build an ethno-nationalist state by making the definition of Ukrainian smaller and smaller and smaller, so that people who live in Ukraine are not at all like Americans. In America, we have hyphenated Americans, but we're all Americans. African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, Hispanics, whatever, what have you. The list goes on and on, but we're all Americans. And that's how Russia functions too. And that's very different in Ukraine, which has opted in the direction of ethno-nationalism. So that doesn't mean that it's okay to wage war on them, by the way. I'm just explaining what has happened. The causes of war actually relate very much to biological weapons of mass destruction, the openly spoken about, a couple of pranksters actually pulled it out. They're actually probably intelligence agents, but a couple of Russian phone hoaxers spoke to the UK, I think he was the military attaché of the foreign ministry or the head of the foreign minister, said, and had them on the phone and discussed how they wanted to join, how they had a plan, that they were ready to be approved to be joined into NATO, that England was going to push them through because they had finally reached the criteria of force potential, which is different for every country. And for Ukraine, it was some 225,000 active service duty and 900,000 reserves. And they discussed on the call as well the potential to have nuclear weapons. And now, these and more the fact that Ukraine could not make decisions on itself because they were being controlled by the Western ruling class, not Ukrainian politicians, who people believe were supposed to be making the decisions. At the peace agreement from 2014, this was the Normandy format, or the Normandy 4 format, of Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia. And they met several times, many times. And during that, the beginning to the end of their format, there was a very big battle in Ukraine, which the pro-Russian rebels in the east won against the Ukrainian army. And this was the Battle of Debaltseve. And this pushed the balance of forces strongly on the side of the rebels whom Russia supported. And so at that agreement at Minsk, Ukraine agreed that they would recognize the autonomy of those republics as a special status. They would have their own elections and their own federal provisions, and that Ukraine would have to make changes to its constitution, of course, to do that, is because they would need to do that, to have a special provision in there. And this cut against the overall drift that had occurred disastrously since the first color revolution in 2004, which had been an increasingly centralization of the state against local governments by the regions or oblasts, like states or provinces, if you will. And all of these taken together created this mess. This is happening within the context of a great reset, a global mystery illness of potentially unknown origins, with a remedy scheme that many people are questioning. I'm obviously not a doctor. I'm a geopolitician, as they say, and an analyst, but my mind is open to many, many questions. And now that the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Russian Ministry of Defense have produced to the UN certified documents from these labs that they, in fact, besides studying anthrax and other biological weapons of mass destruction, that they were conducting research, at least at the lab at Kharkiv, and I believe outside of, I don't want to get this wrong, but I think Odessa. At any rate, one of these labs was engaged in the research of how to transmit viruses from bats to human beings. So this is not speculated. This is not what we think that the Russians are going to say. And it's not beyond possibility that Russians might have forged these documents, except that they were directly leaked by employees of the labs who have names and have been taken into safety. And this was brought to the UN. So there's much more to say, but I think it will come out in the questions. So with that, I will now, ask Matt or Pascal to help me.
Yeah, that was wonderful. That was a very concrete overview, exactly what was needed. I think before we jump into the questions, there's a nice queue forming. I just wanted to reemphasize my appreciation for it. What I really value in people who convey analysis of current events is an appreciation not only for the historical context, but also the structure of mind and how the mind works through ideas and moves from states of ignorance into knowledge by self-reflecting upon the things that we truly know and truly have earned as knowledge versus those things that we've taken on as convictions, but not through having earned them, but rather because our popular friends or group or authorities of experts that we might give our respect to falsely have told us that we should think that. So we have a lot of people have unexamined assumptions which cloud their ability to penetrate through the minefield of misinformation. And after all, as even NATO, we've known this for a long time, but even NATO in their Mind Wars document recently pointed out that the real battlefield is in the mind. And that's just a new document from a year and a half ago that they made public in terms of how to navigate through and weaponize the minds of people. So that's great that you zero in on that, and I appreciate that immensely. And I want everybody else to always think about thinking, because that's really where the battle is located. In how do we analyze our own thoughts and feelings and our own identity in relation to a process? Since we're not looking at a process, we are a part of the process as well, right?
Yes, that's profound. Thank you. Wow.
So with that, Juan and Dr. Le got the first question in. Go for it.
Hi, Joaquin. My question is precisely about the mind of the Western oligarchy. In their own perception, they think themselves as the master of the universe, and that kind of thing cannot change rapidly. What can Russia, China, and Iran do to make them feel fear and pain enough so they realize that they don't deal with the usual third world countries that they are used to?
Very good question. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Very, very well, very clear, very concise. Well, one of the errors that happens when you have a civilization in decline, as we have seen in the West, is that beliefs emerged at a certain time in the history of the development of Western power. And those beliefs were not the beliefs that created the Renaissance, that created the first ages of industry. They're ideas that came much later in time that engage in a type of revisionism and reimagine that the ideas and beliefs and practices of the oligarchs in the West in the present, that those were the beliefs, ideas, and practices that built the civilization that they came out of. So in other words, the ideas that actually built civilization are based in these fundamental principles, universal principles. Whereas the oligarchs in the West today have reimagined history and made it be that it's always been an oligarchy acting in its own self-interest that made civilization. So that's very different from countries like, well, Russia and China, of course, are very advanced countries in many respects, in any respect, and in some respects more advanced now than the so-called Western countries. But what they have shown and have made also a model for the developing world, which caused confusion and even fear for the Western ruling class, has been to show that even though all these different countries have different languages and different political ideologies, they have expressed something about these universal principles when we dig into the more perennial aspect of that when we dig beyond the different framings, whether it's political Islam in Iran, whether it's Marxism, Leninism, and market socialism in China, whether it's sovereign democracy and onward in Russia, these different, political philosophies, underlying them in practice is a view and a practice that the state represents the people, that the legitimacy of the state comes directly from the people, and that the state has authority over the oligarchy. And that idea is terrifying to countries that are run by oligarchies, because while all countries have an oligarchical class, not all countries are run by that oligarchy. These are very different questions. These are very different things. And because in the development of in decay, the wrong ideas that have emerged in the decay of the West, the Western ideal, has been the view that the oligarchs all along have been the one making this show happen. And so when they see that that's not in fact the case, that's in fact what they got wrong about Russia. They thought that the sanctions, that the last round of sanctions and cutting off SWIFT and everything like this was going to cause the oligarchy to rise up against the state successfully. And they had a false belief that the image of the state being more powerful than the oligarchy was an illusion, that was just an idealized form of some legitimating ideology that had no substance in practice, because they could not conceive of a world or of a structure that had succeeded and yet was not in their own image. That's how I would answer that, I think.
Well said. Yeah. Follow-up question from Juan.
Just rapidly.
Okay.
Do you think that I'm a little bit mad thinking that Russia, China, and Iran need to send some missiles with conventional load to atomic load so they begin to understand a little bit? I'm beginning
No,
to be
the frustrations that you feel and the pain, because you're a highly empathic and empathetic person, and when you see the crimes against humanity and the war crimes committed for countless decades in the pursuit of imperial and colonial ambitions, you have seen the children, you have seen innocent people murdered and die painfully and slowly, whether under sanctions or bombs. And so, and this sense of sorrow transforms into anger. But I don't think that you're mad or angry. I don't believe that these countries will respond in that way. I think that they're surviving and they're moving forward is the success that they need and are achieving every day.
Okay, for people who have written out their questions, especially those who have done it very concisely, I appreciate it very much, and I'm presuming that you want me to read it for you. For those who have just put their names on, I'm going to call on you to speak your words yourself. The next question I got here is from Colin, who asks, in the recent Geopolitics and Empire podcast, you spoke about the gargoyle effect with respect to the way we see elite groups and or the way they present themselves to us. Could you reiterate what you said and perhaps expand upon it?
Yes. My idea, the gargoyle effect the thesis, you can hear it very easily and it sticks in the mind like a gargoyle on a building. What it represents, what a gargoyle is, it projects more power than it really is. A gargoyle is just a structure on a building, and it scares other demons away. It scares other spirits away. And the gargoyle effect works like this. It's really in relation to understanding how the ruling class, the transatlantic ruling class, has not only, they present themselves as much more powerful than they really are. And that's a psychological operation that they have effected with great success. And if people had any idea how many comment sections and blogs and conspiracy theory websites were actually constructs of intelligence organizations run by bots and trolls promoting this idea of one world government. Now, to be clear and to be certain, yes, the transatlantic ruling class had a vision and a goal for a one world government, but this goal has basically been defeated. They're always going, for as long as they still have power to try things, they will try things, but for all intents and purposes, it has already been defeated. Now, of course, that puts us in a dangerous situation because they're desperate, and that has led to the Great Reset, and it's led to forcing a confrontation with Russia, which could have nuclear ramifications. And so they are desperate, and that is dangerous, and I can't emphasize that enough. But they actually project that they have much more power than they really do. Just think about how this works in common sense. Just imagine two opposing armies, and if one army can create the illusion that they're 10 times bigger, they can avoid a conflict altogether, a conflict that they might actually lose. Just think about how that works in practical reality. Think about why a blowfish blows up. Think about why bears stand up. Think about all these just very basic analogies in practical everyday life or in visualizable circumstances that you can make this discovery for yourself. And it's not an abstract idea at all. So the discovery of this gargoyle effect was one that has helped me to understand that they have tremendous interest, and so much of their game is based in projecting much more power than they really have. They may have even overstated the number of nuclear weapons that they have. There's many things that one could potentially look at, and I haven't looked at that question, but that's just an example. They certainly are the ones that whenever you see people like, is it Larry Fink or is it any of these big investors connected to the Western banking and speculative economies, they always talk about investing in China and things like this as if China was open to investment along their lines. So they talk their own book and they try to make it seem like they're in something that they're not. So between the practice of upselling, book talking, which has a lot of the economic angles of their, well, in the layman's term, in the vernacular, you would say bullshittery. And it's just, they just make it up out of whole cloth, how much they've invested, how much influence they have. And it really causes us, and really should call upon us, to evaluate our own beliefs and how we think about the problem. Because all of us are politically mature enough to know that when most politicians, and I would say 99.9% of them, open their mouths, they're lying. And when they speak about, when they make big promises about the great things that they're going to do, we know that it's probably not true. But then when they talk about things that scare us, and this is the gargoyle effect, when they talk about things that scare us, when they talk about things that they're on the verge of doing, these might be decades away, or the technology might not even be feasible. But they say these things to project much more power than they really have. This is something that they are aware of. They do it intentionally. With regard to the World Economic Forum, they actually misrepresent how their organization actually works. And I say merely because they have tremendous influence in developing white papers and friendly accompanying documents to be used at the UN, but it's not the UN. They're really the think tank for the IMF. So even though Klaus Schwab would like to say that he has a lot of influence in influencing parliamentarians of Europe and maybe Latin America, certainly Canada and the US, despite him saying that, that's not where the leverage for the World Economic Forum comes from. Where it comes from is the IMF's ability to determine the loan structures of loans to developing countries. So that means that the more powerful and sovereign a country is, the less power the IMF has over it. So that's how I would approach the gargoyle effect. It really establishes that the transatlantic ruling class has a vested interest in making you think that they're more powerful than they are, and they do that in many different ways. They do it through their own talking their book, through their own making up stories about where they're investing, that they don't actually have access to capital markets. They pretend that they do. Or they can't be more than like a 3% owner or something like that. Nowhere near enough to have controlling stake of these things. They act like they do, and they'll have an investment firm that maybe has like a few percents in something, downstream or upstream in some concern in China, and that's okay. And they'll get a lot of people to invest in their, endeavor on account of that. I'm not saying that they don't make returns on those investments. It's just China has sovereign policy on these things, and they're not allowing the enemies of China to own China. They've been through that before, and they got through it. They had the opium crisis. They had a period of decline before that. In many ways, starting in maybe even the late 1600s or 1700s, they've been through this before. China knows their history. So yes, good enough.
Yeah, and on that point, and I didn't know about the gargoyle effect until you just developed that, and I really like that. Just to add my little 2 cents in before the next question, I just thought back to 2 factors or 2 examples. One being the testimony of many of the escaped slaves who escaped from the U.S. Deep South on the Underground Railroad, who described, like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass has accounts of this, of the biggest problem not being the physical ability to get the slaves into the Underground Railroad, but the ability to get them to overcome the concentration camp, the cage in their mind that was set up out of the illusion that was created for them by their slave masters of the torture chambers, the great army of white slave masters who were waiting on the outskirts of the plantations to capture them, and what fate would behold them if they tried to even think about escaping. And so that was the biggest challenge. And the other example was the panopticon of Jeremy Bentham.
Jeremy Bentham, same thing. Yeah,
that he recognized that you only need like 1 or 2 guards in a well-organized panopticon prison system to manage thousands of people, with the idea that they always feel like they're being watched, and that itself will allow them to police themselves, with certain stories, again, of torture chambers and other things of those who tried to challenge that structure. So that's very, very obviously just illusory, as you pointed out. So I do like the gargoyle effect idea very, very much. For the next question, okay, well, we have Felicity, who asks, why do you think a thermonuclear war is imminent or highly likely, and what is the benefit of that to the elite, cabal, bad guys, whatever? That's the question.
Yes, I would actually say this connects very much to the gargoyle effect. When Lavrov said that the transatlantic elites were no longer agreement capable, it wasn't just because, the president couldn't guarantee what the CIA would do, couldn't guarantee what the Pentagon would do. That's one reason they were non-agreement capable. The other is that it looks like there was some deterrence or even superiority strategy developed out of either the CIA or the Pentagon, Langley boys, who developed this idea that if they could convince opponents that in fact the United States had gone into a post-rational direction, that were crazy, that the leadership is actually crazy, that you can't actually reason with them, then that anything might trigger them to set things off. We talked about the promotion of conspiracy theories, and not all of them are false per se, but they heavily involve in, this idea that that the elites have bases underground that can house hundreds of thousands, like at Denver Airport, or that they might have something on the dark side of the moon, that they are willing to make a nuclear war, that they are promoting this, that part of this, the idea, it's a little bit nuanced and it's complex because they do have a neo-Malthusian agenda to reduce the world population for some reasons, okay, that are all wrong, but they're different from the ones that sound crazy. So there's the wrong ideas that are actually crazy, but sound rational when you look at them. Well, overpopulation, hunger, the environment, it's actually wrong, but it doesn't sound crazy. But then they have things that they promote that actually do sound crazy, and they promote them at arm's length, and they populate conspiracy theory views throughout different, it's the internet, right? So it's like you can't describe it beyond. There's many different internets. So we actually operate. We all operate in different internets, even though we don't have to. And so they have basically promoted this idea that they're not afraid to use nuclear weapons, knowing that it would end the world, and then they've created a reasonable suspicion that, since they've also floated through their gargoyle effect fake conspiracy theory channels that they only want 500 million people on the planet or 1 billion people on the planet, then ICBMs, nuclear armed ICBMs, and 5,000 of them going off at once would accomplish that. Now, it's possible that they do want to do that. I mean, that they're the porcupine might stick its spikes out and puff them out, but they will pierce your skin. So it's like I said, there are many layers to this. They certainly want to intimidate potential opponents by making them think that they don't have the concern of mutually assured destruction, by making a lot of this great reset stuff about automation, even the way that they've handled, this is going to get a little deep, even the way they've handled the vaccination regimen. And with the data coming out that people are having a lot of adverse effects, including death, Pfizer published that. It's not my opinion. I'm not entitled to an opinion in this field, but I can factually represent what Pfizer put in their handout that comes with the vaccine, that one of the side effects is death. And they're able to gargoyle other countries into thinking, it's like historically, the biggest asset in a country were human beings, was population. And if they have convinced people that they're already on the verge of, AI and robots and automation, and that, hey, yeah, you know what? Nuke us, kill our people because we're trying to kill them ourselves and you'll just help us out on our agenda. There may be elements of that are true, but you can certainly see how lying about that and making people think that goes a very long distance. So now it could happen, but I think that what we are seeing right now is Russia calling their bluff. I don't think that they have a secret base on Mars. I think that maybe they're having problems with the technology in general. Maybe even the moon is difficult. I don't know. It's not my field, but I've listened to experts with a curious and critical pair of ears. And a lot of these things about the idea that the elites might have planned a breakaway civilization and might be hoping to start a nuclear war may indeed be false. Other ideas float about they float these openly. So, for example, I believe it was either the Washington Post or the New York Times published an article, why a limited nuclear war might help with global warming. And this is a literal headline. This is not The Onion or Babylon Bee. And what they explain is that the nuclear winter that would follow, just a small nuclear winter, would be enough to eliminate and maybe reset the global warming pattern. So, sort of like the dinosaur extinction event, that it would kick up enough dust and things like this. And yes, it's, but these are all intelligence operations that are very much connected to the gargoyle effect. And I can't say with any high degree of certitude which way they would go with that. And that's why I'm here to say there is a real threat of this.
Mm-hmm. I was disturbed to encounter so many young people when I was organizing more frequently around a certain university in Montreal who were trying to make the case to me that the Dark Ages were actually are given a bad rap and are actually a period of wonderful stable populations. Humans were more in tune holistically with the environment, with nature before industrial civilization set things awry. And in fact, these students were being taught by God knows how many teachers positioned to indoctrinate them into this interpretation that indeed it was the Renaissance itself that was what unleashed the virus that is human beings. And if we could just undo that scientifically, it's actually good to have a dark age. It's not a bad thing to, So what you were saying about the fact
nuclear winter, yeah,
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 a weaponization of optimism there. That's interesting. I'm going to skip the next question and save it for near the end by Persistent Tiger, because it's sort of an end of conversation question. Well, what do we do? But I'll skip right now to CJ, who's asking on behalf of somebody watching on a live stream. Can you explain the Russian nuclear posture as to the use of nuclear weapons?
Yes, that's very clearly defined. I can answer it in 30 seconds or less than 30 seconds. Their posture is existential threat. So if there's an existential threat posed, meaning their existence, that doesn't mean a terms of defeat that they're uncomfortable with. That doesn't mean they think that they're losing a given conflict. Existential threat is existential threat. And that is why the idea that they would use nuclear weapons or even a small one in this conflict is ludicrous. Why you're hearing this in fake news, corporate media from Western countries may more probably be because Russians will use conventional weapons like they have in Lviv and to hit military targets and oil supplies. And it would be possible to bring in people after one of these bombs and contaminate it with radiation and then say, oh, they used a low nuclear yield or something. So they used a mini nuke or something. It only takes about 500 tons of TNT or 300 tons of dynamite to create the blast type and mushroom cloud seen at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are considered smaller nukes by today's standards, but would still be bigger than a mini nuke, but it's closer to a mini nuke by today's standards. So a mini nuke could be artificially simulated and lied about with maybe 1 to 200 tons. I think 1 to 200 tons. Yeah, 1 to 200 tons of dynamite would create the appearance, mushroom cloud and everything, and a big radius of damage, 1 to 5 miles of absolute damage. But you wouldn't have the radiation signature of a nuclear weapon. But if you saw the types of false flags that they set up in Syria and the way that they pretended that and imagined that that the Assad government used chemical weapons simply by sending their own people there to then contaminate things with small areas and then bring in other objective third party, be like, oh yes, those things are there, even though the crime scene was contaminated by the accusing party. They could easily try to do that. They might even do that in Poland or in parts of Ukraine to try to escalate in a very ugly direction.
Rohit asks, what is your view of the events in Kazakhstan prior to the invasion of Ukraine? And also, secondarily, rumors are circulating that Russia has issued an arrest warrant for George Soros. Could you confirm or deny such claims?
I didn't come today, unfortunately, prepared to speak on the question of Kazakhstan, so accept my apologies on that. I do know that they have undergone recently a change of power and are more closely aligned with Russia than they were previously, but this is a work in progress. Kazakhstan was a former Soviet republic, and it's one of the success stories of the transatlanticists to break it off of what was the Soviet Union. The aim is to bring them further in. They formally are a part of many different treaty organizations and important ones with Russia, but their leadership was vacillating and showing very weird signs. That looks like it will be corrected now. What has floated with the arrest warrant is from 2015 or 2016, and sometimes these news stories, get recirculated. I certainly am of the opinion, of the view that if Soros went into Russia, he would be arrested, but the arrest warrants actually apply to the entire organization and any of the NGOs should they operate in the Russian Federation. So actually not just Soros, but all of them, any employee of Soros organizing an NGO in Russia would be arrested. So that arrest warrant it's not a warrant, it's a law about those things. If Soros was in Russia to do the organizing, he'd be arrested too. So it's, I would say, 50% true, and it's from 7 years ago.
Right. And on that note, for those who think that Russia or China are just complicit in the Great Reset and it's all a big game, Russia did, as you said, in 2015, completely ban Soros's operations, as with many other organizations, and that involved Russia joining the club of really sane nations like China, which had earlier banned Soros and his operations in 1989. So since 1989, if any Soros operation has tried to spring up in China, that would immediately be considered an illegal act, which is interesting. So just throwing that in there. Luke asks, can you explain your understanding of the role that the RAND Corporation plays in the military-industrial complex, or as Ray McGovern updated it to include the MICIMAT military-industrial, congressional intelligence, media academic think tank complex? Is the RAND Corporation controversial in your opinion? Who are its competitors, if any?
That's a very multi-layered question about the military-industrial complex and the role of the RAND Corporation. You could almost every American company is actually involved in the military-industrial complex, and anything, Raytheon, General Dynamics, the old McDonnell Douglas, and all of these were all very important. Chemical concerns, all of these, but the question is not so much of competition, because all of these have such strong influence in Congress, because they lobby, and they are not just special interests, but they're privileged by the, well, I guess in the vernacular we call it the cabal or the deep state, just in the layman's, in the permanent administration and through the Pentagon, and also through the intelligence organs, all the three-letter agencies and more. They do in fact privilege these companies, and they basically operate without competition. So they have almost there's no competition in their bids. They just basically say what their price will be, and that's the price that they get. And how this influenced how the influence of this into universities and academia, of course, has transformed over the decades. As the understanding of what's called soft power grew and grew, and basically a lot of these same the owners of these companies are also engaged in philanthropy, and so even though they do project, if you were in universities between the 1950s and 1980s, you would have been subjected to a certain way that they influenced academia to promote the goodness of American military hegemony. But what they did, and it really began to change, I say symbolically, like we can think about it in this year, when Bill Clinton came to power, it wasn't him who pulled the lever, but that's just the time marker, right, in time. When Bill Clinton came to power, they actually transformed into a soft power direction of trying to weaponize the sort of countercultural and peace and freedom movement that grew out of the 60s and 70s and make that be more like the ideology of the American state, so that when we were going into other countries, that we weren't fighting communism or just fighting for the American national interest or something like it used to be put, like national security, but that we were literally attacking a country to defend LGBTQ communities, to defend ethnic minorities in those countries, to actually engage in the development of democracy as defined in the center-left vision of democracy. And even though none of those things were realized in these countries that they went in, they were able to even draw in a lot of these Soros organizations. Exactly, that's how these work. These Soros organizations don't just operate like in color revolutions. They operate and they go in along with the invading forces as well. And anyone, for example, who has spent time on the Ukrainian, on the Reddit page for the International Brigade for the Defense of Ukraine, which are attracting a lot of neo-Nazis and soldiers of fortune, and we call them wereaboos, people who thought that the Nazi Wehrmacht should have won and could have won, if not for the semi-Asiatic Mongol horde of Russia, that they actually promoted, they actually have the view, excuse me, they actually promote the view of that, how to say it? Well, I'll put it like this. They approach the question of the Doctors Without Borders as if they themselves are mercenaries. So you have representatives from Doctors Without Borders, that's Médecins Sin Frontières, etc., Doctoros Sin Fronteras or whatever, and you think that this is like a humanitarian human rights thing. You think, many people maybe have children who may be going to medical school or something, but they're torn because they wanted to join the Peace Corps, or maybe they voted for Bernie Sanders or something, and these are all fine intentions, don't get me wrong. But the people really involved in that they interact with mercenaries, they interact with mercenary armies. On this Reddit page, you have representatives from Doctors Without Borders openly interacting with neo-Nazi volunteers that want to go to Ukraine, and they're advising them about, how to be and how to get in, because they operate identically. These so-called humanitarian NGOs operate with the same logic, the same precautions, through the same vehicles and the same organizations as these neo-Nazi mercenary outfits or soldiers of fortune outfits. In fact, at the base that was infamously bombed by Russia in Ukraine, that housed these soldiers of fortune and neo-Nazi mercenaries, this happened, a week or 10, 15 days ago? Every day has been so long now, I've lost track, but it happened a week or two ago. And, they were there organized as part of the credentials of this international brigade, was intermixed with humanitarian relief organizations, yet they're armed. So yes, I would answer it like that.
Before you go on, let me just ask you, Joaquin, how long do you have? I don't have any particular time limit on my side, but what about you?
I have a 19-month-old daughter who's who's ill, and she might get loud, but I'm good for what you are and for the audience.
Okay, good. So the next question is from Stephen.
Hi, Joaquin. Thanks so much for sharing your wisdom and insight with us. My background is military, so obviously I tend to think in kind of grand strategic terms when I'm looking at these sort of events in our talk. I think it was Matt mentioned NATO's mind wars as sort of a betrayal of its philosophy or belief. I know with Russia, you have General Gerasimov and his concept of hybrid war, or the Russian concept of hybrid war. And to me, that brings to mind not just events in Ukraine, but the SWIFT exclusion and all that sort of economic stuff that you brought up. And I'm going to actually bring in Gaddafi in Libya just very briefly. From what I've been able to discern, I think one of the real reasons that NATO went in, if I understand it correctly, was that Gaddafi was looking to introduce a gold-backed Pan-African dinar. And to my mind, that exposes the fear and the real Achilles heel of the whole broader Western malevolent entity, and essentially fraudulent banking and monetary system, economic system. And if I can kind of come to that conclusion, sure as heck, the Russian general staff and their political leadership can. Do you see as part of, assuming that the Russians are not just conducting an isolated action in Ukraine, but it's part of a broader grand strategic effort, do you see the Russians reintroducing precious metals-backed currencies or Hamiltonian economics or anything? Is there a dimension of that we're not seeing that perhaps we should?
Yes. So, with regard to hybrid war, of course, well, I look at both Hoffman, on the American side, Hoffman's framework for hybrid war, and then I combine that with Lynn's framework of fourth generational warfare when I assess these things. And I have developed upon this, looking at the psychological dimensions of social control involving Baudrillard and the creation of simulacrum or hyperreality as part of hybrid war, which involves virtual reality and all kinds of, really simulacrums. That's also connected to the gargoyle effect that we discussed. So that's my framework. With regard to Libya, I can confirm that they were moving in a direction very quickly to develop a gold-based dinar, and they had the full support of many African states, and they were also very engaged with South Africa on the very opposite end of this giant continent, which actually most countries in the world would all fit in right now. Africa is a massive, massive continent. It takes up the whole side of the planet, in fact, and it is this type of development of the physical economy would also have financed the terraforming of the Sahara Desert. Gaddafi sent experts in geology and in the forgive my ignorance in the subject, but at any rate, they found that there was aquifers underwater, that under the Sahara, which I suppose around 10,000 years ago was in fact a tundra, and before that a rainforest, that a lot of the water that made this possible is still right there underground. And so they had plans to terraform the Sahara Desert and to restore it to arable, farmable land, which would allow human population to exceed 40 or 30 billion without scarcity of food and things like this. In addition to that, it now looks like Egypt is moving in a direction to take up that mantle. If you actually look at Egypt, even though it takes up a big physical piece of land, the actual area that people can live in the arable regions make basically 2 city-states. And it looks like the leadership in Egypt is moving in the direction of taking up what Gaddafi was going to do with regard to that. And then your second or third question, sorry.
I'm just, with regards to that gold-backed dinar, the Pan-African one.
Oh, and Russia, yes, sorry,
Russia
yes.
looking at the same thing, having discovered that's a weakness, an Achilles heel of the West?
Yeah. So that's correct. It's a very good question, and thank you. Just the other day, the Russian central bank announced that they were setting their value of their ruble to gold at at a price that's $10 per gram stronger than the present valuation of the ruble, which already has rebounded by 60 to 65% since Monday or Tuesday of this week, when Russia announced that their plan going forward would be to only accept gas payments for their gas in rubles, which requires even countries that have sanctions on them to basically get rid of those sanctions, at least on the central bank and Spare Bank and a few other major banks that are connected to the central bank in Russia. It certainly echoes or parallels concepts in Alexander Hamilton's ideas, for sure. I think that many political languages could describe similar, but yes. And so now with that move from last week, and then this announcement that this is a program that's going to start effectively now, taking those two together, they effectively are introducing. They're saying that the gold that they have in their reserves is physical. They've denied the claims through this gargoyle effect that Russia was really hurt and that they had all this gold in Swiss accounts and offshore accounts that were frozen. They said that's fake news. We have all the gold that we have is two kind. We have our sovereign gold, and we have your gold deposits for the purchase of resources, oil and gas. And these are vaults. We have physical possession is the term that they use, and we have vaults that are open for inspection.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jerry.
Yes, thanks, Matt. And thank you, Joaquin, for your sharing your excellent insights with us. And it's kind of like an antidote for the mainstream medium that we get stuck with over here. Being in Canada, we get the narrative that's fed to us. I like that word narrative, because they don't even try to attempt to tell the truth or the news. It's just a narrative they give us. And, our government's in lockstep with the World Economic Forum and that. But there is an opposition to it, which you see, like the Freedom Convoy and that. So I understand the situation in Canada is quite fluid. And to a lesser extent, I see the situation in the United States somewhat similar. And thanks to yourself and Matt, I'm getting kind of an insight into how the Russians look at this and the Chinese. But my problem is I don't have a clue about the Europeans, because they seem to be like trapped in the middle of this thing where you get, the United States and Britain and Canada yelling and screaming at them for war. But then on the other hand, they see Russia and they kind of get a glimpse of reality. It's right there. So Europe's kind of trapped in between, like, the sacrificial lamb or whatever you want to call it. But here in Canada, I don't have any idea of how the average person in Europe is thinking about this Ukraine crisis and that. And I was just hoping that you might have some ideas or some insight you can share with us about what's going on in Europe, because I just don't see it here.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Europe can really be understood as three distinct areas. There are really three layers in the European Union that operate sort of as different moving parts that have a different orientation towards Brussels. And the first is the core EU, like Germany and France and well, Belgium, Luxembourg, things like this. And then that's actually a pretty small primary zone when you think about it. Netherlands, you have some of the few of the Nordic states that are in EU, but you don't have much more than that. Then you have the first periphery EU, and they are just absolutely opposed to Brussels for different reasons that maybe German nationalists or something are opposed to Brussels, but they're legitimately having a problem with the structure of the EU because when the euro dollar was rolled, or the euro was rolled out, not the euro dollar, excuse me, when the euro was rolled out, their purchasing power was cut in half overnight. And these are what's called the PIGS countries. That's Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. PIIGS. And then you have what Donald Rumsfeld calls New Europe. And these are the Balkans and Eastern Europe that were brought into the EU most recently in the scheme of things. And they have a different orientation, different attitude also. Actually, many of these countries were very industrially advanced, much more than Spain or Greece or Italy. And the structure of the European Union does not allow them to use their industry, and has actually caused industry and fields to go fallow and to not be used in any way. So there is untapped potential. There are right now factories in places like Bulgaria and Romania and Poland that have been shut down for decades, but wouldn't take much to upgrade, and in the scheme of things, relative, and began to produce. Again, costs of things would dramatically reduce. People would have an idea that maybe they could have more than 0 children. They would move from being renters to homeowners. And you would see a new golden age in Europe by making full use of the physical economy. The structure of the European Union is designed so that there's no advantage conferred. The way that the ECB, well, really the whole troika, the way that it works is that it disincentivizes countries from doing anything other than being a debt-driven economy that focuses its budget on health and human services on the condition now that you're vaccinated. So you have this crisis in Europe that many Europeans are acutely aware of. And while educational standards have decreased in Europe, they haven't decreased as fast as they did decrease in the United States. So there is a lot of political awareness in Europe about this, which is even greater than what you saw in basically in Europe. In every country, something close to half the population has been doing things like trucker convoys for several decades. France, Spain, Italy, even sometimes Germany. Though it would be wrong to say that the average German citizen is a net is on a net gain from Euro policies. Nevertheless, Germany is considered to be, at least its ruling class is considered to be a privileged group among equals. So I think that now, in terms of Europe's, like you said, the self-destructive course that they're on is being dictated by the transatlantic banks. And yet it works against the interests of both smaller private banks in Europe and the industries that rely on them, the big industries that relate to them as well. What's different about Europe is that they really don't have a truly independent currency set up the way that the US dollar is. And so they're connected to the petrodollar. So as the petrodollar goes down, the euro goes down too. The only way that they can get out of that is if they actually value their currency in relationship to the value of the energy that they get from Russia in terms of the energy potential towards production and development of the physical economy. Only if their currency was a reflection of real GDP, which could also be expressed in gold as well. So there's many different, it's not either or. A lot of people like to say it's either or. There's many different angles to this. They would be able to not have this problem. So now nothing I'm saying is either really debated very heavily, nor is it a surprise to many people in Europe. The issue seems to be that there are we talked about three zones, but within the core of Europe, within, let's say, Germany, France, and the smaller countries that surround them immediately, they know that they have three distinct trajectories that are possible. There's a transatlantic trajectory, there's a European sovereigntist trajectory, and there's a Eurasian integration trajectory. And for decades, the European sovereigntists have been allied, basically European industrialists, okay, and private banks have been smaller private banks, or they're still very big banks, but not at the level of the, Deutsche Bank or something like this. They have had their lot in with the monetary policy of the U.S. and transatlanticism, which is also a military commitment as well through NATO. So historically and up until recently, the Eurasian integrationists have been the tiniest and smallest group, and it's more of a think tank thing, which gives good advice to industries. For example, well, here's one example. So Mercedes has been looking at a project for 7 years to get around growing sanctions with Russia, because they'd like to sell Mercedes in Russia, to do value-added labor in Serbia, which is not in EU and it's not in sanctions. And then from Serbia, then those products go to Russia as made in Serbia, but they're German. So there are Eurasianists who do have influence with German industrialists, but now that the European sovereigntists, the financial aspects of European sovereigntists can see that the transatlantic agenda is potentially something like seen in the film Children of Men, where Europe is actually a failed state with different small, militias fighting each other, like you've seen in Aleppo or Idlib. And there's very strong indication that the transatlanticists would like to level Europe for a third time, and use the threat of that, and to use the energy crisis with Russia to push European armies into a conflict with Russia, which would produce the same result at any rate. So yes, I hope that answers the question. Thank you, Gerald.
I'm going to do something where I've been trying to keep things in a sequential ordering, and I'm going to continue to try to do that as best I can. But sometimes I don't want to shift too much from one seed of thought or one topic to another too abrasively. So sometimes I'll make an exception, like right now. Scott in Vancouver asked a multifaceted question which touches on this economic fight, but I like this question, and I'll just read it out as best I can. He said, could Joaquin provide further info on any plans for the Russian government expansion to nationalize the sanctioned foreign Wall Street funded private parasite conglomerates that have controlled otherwise public service utilities in Russia, regions, etc., waterworks, electrical, etc., and the potential economic boon to the Russian economy due to a synergy in, as he puts it, American system economic methodology for transformative productivity based upon the new public corporations and government. That's one. Hold that in mind. Okay. He adds to that.
Okay, got that. Okay.
And the potential partnership with Chinese state banks who are already more advanced in this.
Okay.
I'll leave that there.
Yes, very good. All right. First of all, the internal mechanisms of the Russian economy is that it's 40 to 45% public assets anyway. It's public owned. in Russia. 40 to 45% of all the economy, effectively the physical economy, is a public asset. So now, this is a very good question also because it underscores that Russia is a federal republic. It's not a dictatorship. And it's true that in all these different, well, in the US, we call them states or, provinces, oblasts and regions. And they're listed in the Russian constitution. Cities of particular importance, like city-states within Russia, and they also have autonomous republics inside of Russia too. And the governors and mayors and leaders of these have significant autonomy to make decisions and have been able to work with foreign investors and foreign firms, including Americans, to do all kinds of things, some decent, some not so decent. It's a mixed bag. Not every American interest in Russia is a bad interest. It's countries have to allow themselves to be taken over, and Russia has not allowed that since the moving out of the Yeltsin period. We've discussed what they're doing in terms of what Russia's doing in terms of central banking already, so you can see how by bringing metal, in particular gold, into the equation, and then putting that in relationship to the value of their energy export asset, and then having countries, buy rubles, you can see how that, I think that what we talked about, I think, answers that part of the question. At least the one who asked the question will immediately synthesize that into their answer. And then with China, well, I think the most important takeaway with China is that because of their integration into what used to be a more global economy until the Great Reset started, but it's still critical. A lot of these sanctions against Russia, because this is really how I look at the role of Chinese banking, a lot of these sanctions against Russia can just be rerouted through China. And it's very bizarre because it kind of strengthens China's position, okay, which is in fact an American strategy that will fail, because the thinking of American oligarchs who project oligarchic thinking into societies where the state is anti-oligarchic, they think that the Chinese oligarchy is going to ultimately want to take, Kamchatka and Siberia, and that they think that the Chinese want to take Russian land, and that if they can even allow China in some ways to get stronger, or to squeeze them in ways that they're only stronger in some ways and weaker in ways, you can fine-tune sanctions that can push countries into certain directions. But that's based in, it actually goes back to the first question from Kwan earlier about how the Western elites misunderstand how these other countries operate. So I hope I got most of that question answered for you, but I would move forward and balance the rest, or follow up if there's time after.
All right. I don't know in which order Matthew wanted to go by next. I see that you just left for a moment. So I'm just going to go with the next one, which was Nazakat, who actually a question coming from Sajid Patel. I don't know if Nazakat, you want to ask it yourself, or if you want us to read it. Sorry, Matt, I didn't know in which order you want.
No, that's great. Yeah, just go ahead and read it, Pascal.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just...
You could read both Nazakat's and the one from CJ as well. Just combine them both.
Okay, one second. I'm just scrolling back. So Nazakat's question was actually from Sajid Patel, who loves Joaquin. That's what he says, and started listening to to you when Morris interviewed you. The question is, if Russia continued to outmatch NATO on all fronts, will they still risk World War III? That's a question from Nazakat, well, Sajid. And the question from CJ, is it the next one? Yeah, okay. So I thought you had asked that one, Matthew. No?
No, that's a new one.
Oh, okay. So from YouTube, can Joaquin touch on what does he see for the future of Ukraine? Will it be broken up into different countries, or who is winning, in quotes, is winning in between Russia and Ukraine?
Okay. Yeah. Could you just remind me the first question? I should have written that down.
Yeah, no worries. It was about, if Russia continued to outmatch NATO on all fronts, will they still risk World War III?
Okay, yes. Well, so what we looked at, we talked about this gargoyle effect and pretending that you're crazy and stuff like this. So obviously the posture of the West is nuclear first strike on the table. We're floating this idea that we think that we can survive a nuclear war. That has been a position, you know, that at times has been tried going back to the 50s. We can win a nuclear war. And later with, you know, détente, START, these things, the idea was no one's going to win a nuclear war. And with the Great Reset, and we talked about this floating the idea, like that they're even kind of trying to massage this idea to convince other countries or whatever outside of the globalist endeavor that the Western elite think that they can win a nuclear war. So Russia's parity with NATO in all kinds of war, all types of simulations, and based on the observations of war games and analysis of potential force, if the US did not get involved in a war between Russia and Europe, and if Russia didn't have a particular concern for the loss of human life, and if the war was conventional, non-nuclear, Russia would win. Russia would beat all of the countries in Europe combined in a conventional war if human life was not a consideration. When the US gets involved in that, it changes the equation. I don't know by how much, or if analysis on by how much is even reliable at this point. The thing is that the Russians don't have a doctrine of trying to win a conventional war against Europe and the United States. That at that point would become probably an existential threat and would be a nuclear war by their doctrine, and I assume by US doctrine as well, which seems to have a lower standard anyhow of starting a nuclear war on paper for reasons that we discussed. Like, do you believe that we're crazy? Can we convince you that we can't make agreements? So, but NATO is different from Russia because Russia is a single command, and NATO are a lot of countries that have different levels of commitment. And it actually follows up on the question about the structure of the EU, because what I didn't say was that there are countries that are in the EU but are not in the EU in many ways in terms of being in lockstep with NATO. And Austria vacillates back and forth. Hungary seems firmly like they're neutral in the Western sense of the word. And then NATO, you have Turkey is already a country that Russia has engaged with militarily in the skies of Syria. Russia has bombed Turkish assets, Turkish commanders, advisors that were embedded with the TFSA, Turkish FSA. A Turkish plane shot down a Russian plane, could have gone very crazy. That was actually a plot to undermine Erdogan's authority. I'm not an Erdogan supporter, but he's less crazy than the plan that the US had to overthrow him and to put in a Western-backed puppet. Erdogan is certainly creating an independent policy for Turkey. That's not always a good thing if you're an Armenian or a Kurd or a Bulgarian or a Serbian and many other things, or Greek especially. But nevertheless, it means that they can make rational decisions which are less likely to lead to conflicts. Doesn't mean that I'm not a good guy versus bad guy thinker, as you can see. I just talk about what are the balance of things and what seems likely. Yeah, so who is winning in Russia, in Ukraine, rather? Everybody agrees, no one disagrees that Russia wins this. That means that they're winning. It's just not what you see being explained in the way that the maps are shown to the public. They focus impressionistically on certain battles, real or imagined. But what happens is what fake news has been using is the Institute on the Study of War maps. And those are very bad maps. They're confusing maps. They're not necessarily wrong, but they're misinterpreted intentionally by fake news. Institute for the Study of War is not a big think tank. It's a mom and pop operation, like a lot of decent think tanks are, but they happen to be purely creating propaganda for the so-called deep state. Why? Because credible institutions of the deep state wouldn't produce maps that fake. So they outsource the fakery to them. It works identical to the Bellingcat outfit that people may know of that created fake geolocation stuff about Syria and Ukraine war 8 years ago. Bellingcat turned out to be just a man in his mom's basement or something. And not that mom's basement's a bad place to be, but it just wasn't a government institution. Or like it wasn't like it was Brookings Institute or something like this, but Institute for the Study of War maps, the reason that Westerners think that Russia is losing is because of the information war. And it has to do with how much we should support, because in human psychology, people are less likely to support something that's losing. And they're more likely to support something that it looks like it could just win if we just blow over the edge and we just give it a push. So it actually fits. It's actually the view being created in the West is precisely a view fine-tuned by social psychologists and people from marketing, very much like the Bernaysian revolution in advertising and marketing. And it's not that, so it's like they're not losing and they're not winning so much that we don't have to help them. And they're not losing by so much that if we help them that we're going to get hurt too and lose our guys. It's just, they're losing over here, but they really could win. And they could win if we just help them. They'll lose if we don't. They'll lose by a little bit and just barely if we don't help them. But if we just help them, they'll win. If we help them a little bit, they'll win. And that's exactly how they've fine-tuned this, and to make you invested in the story and to be attached. And then, of course, they create the refugee thing and they're the victims and everything. It works very beautifully, really, from the point of view of the schematics and the strategy of it. It certainly is elegant. then so, but there's no question. Fortunately, there's been some view of the truth coming from, of all people, General Flynn and lesser figure, lower rank retired Colonel McGregor. They've both done, at least McGregor's done a good media tour. Then also Scott Ritter, the well-known from back in the weapons of mass destruction days, the UN weapons inspector. Through these three people have helped in some way reach many alternative audiences on mainstream social media, on YouTube and everything, talking to audiences on the both, Democrat audiences and Republican audiences. That's been very good. Telling the truth from February 24th, Russia won this war. And it's very misleading to look at maps, because the assumptions are of what the Western media said their goals are not, and how they achieve those goals are not what their goals are, nor how they achieve those goals. So so even looking at good maps can be very misleading. They haven't lost any territory, and they always, they haven't lost any cities. They continue to take cities, and that's just an objective analysis. Whether you want Russia to win or lose, everyone agrees. You have communiques coming directly from the Azov battalion saying we are up against an overwhelmingly superior force, but we are, fighting hard and giving stiff resistance, and come help us and send the money. It's no one thinks that Russia loses this. No one thinks that Russia can lose or will lose this. That's actually been a lot of there are realists, and they're not allowed to speak their mind, but they are allowed to think privately, and it's clear in some of the decisions and hedges made by countries like Poland, even less sane countries than Poland in terms of government, like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. They're more like Ukraine in the sense of they actually like Hitler, and they are not trying to tangle with this. They know exactly what the war games look like. They know exactly what happens. They know exactly what the Rumsfeld doctrine of New Europe is. It's basically, remember the South Park? There was like a South Park episode that was poking fun of U.S. military, of just basically, send the black guys in first. It was like Operation Get Behind the Black Guy. And, and basically New Europe is the black guy. And all these New Europe countries, I'm talking about former Warsaw Pact, Eastern Europe countries, where NATO is really has the most support. They actually know that they're like the human shields of Europe, and they don't want to be that. But there's been so many billions of dollars put in there, and IMF loan relief, and there's so many ways they've been bought and paid for, but they still realize that they are the nuclear impact zone of Europe. And they're the first zone of fast, like blitzkrieg conquest by Russia in the event of a conventional war. So that's winning. That's what it looks like. Now it's really a question of how Russia does things. Just look at the Syria stuff, their foreign policy, their method of balancing. All those are considerations, but I won't belabor or bore you with the details. And then what does Ukraine look like in the end? Well, there's many possible outcomes. In my view, there are certain things that are potential bargaining chips, but not bargaining chips for any government that exists in Ukraine today. We're just talking about bargaining chips to entice Ukrainian oligarchs to be nationalized by Russia and converted into what they call tycoons. So Russia has Russia is not a plutocracy, but Russia has oligarchs. But when oligarchs run the country, it's called a plutocracy. But every country has oligarchs. It doesn't mean that the country is a plutocracy. So Ukraine was a plutocracy until it became annexed by the United States. Effectively, there's no decision that can be made by anyone in Ukraine without consulting the State Department, which means that they are a puppet government, just like any of the so-called like independent Croatia was during the Third Reich. It was a puppet state of the Third Reich, and Ukraine is not a sovereign state at this time. It had already failed to exist as a sovereign state, and has already been taken over by another country. We're not talking about that they were taken over by corporations like in the sort of neoliberal Washington consensus model of, oh, this country's not really sovereign because, you know, United Fruit or US Steel or Rand or, you know, IBM or whatever controls, or McDonald's controls that, you know, has lobbyists and stuff. No. The US State Department is in control of the government in Kiev, which has already fled and operates out of the US Embassy in Warsaw. We've all but confirmed that solidly. There's lots of hard evidence on that. So Kiev wasn't run from Kiev for a long time. It was run from Washington since 2014. And moreover, the puppets of Kiev are now in the US Embassy in Warsaw. So that is why you hear things from Zakharova, from Putin, from the entire Russian diplomatic and executive branch, usual suspects that continue to question if Ukraine's even a viable project, because they were run by oligarchs and the oligarchs sold the country. And that's what happens when you are a country that's run by oligarchs. You end up selling the country. That's the outcome. And then the outcomes of Ukraine then are maybe to entice some oligarchs like Akhmetov and others to become nationalized and just become tycoons, to give up their plutocratic aspirations, and they can still make money on sovereign development projects, but the territory of Ukraine will be a landlocked country. It will be probably an ally of Russia, which they call neutral. When Russia says neutral, that means ally, in terms of, they use the word in a very interesting way. They refer to enemies as colleagues and partners. They refer to allies as neutral. So everything is one step over in a funny way. And then, so Belarus is part of the union state with Russia, and they're called a neutral country. So Russia calls Belarus neutral, and they're literally part of both their trade union, a union state, and their military alliance. And that's what they call neutral. So when they say we want neutrality, we want Ukraine to be neutral, that's what they mean. When they tell Serbia that they want Serbia to pursue neutrality, that's what they mean. That's why they engage with the annual Brotherhood military drills with Belarus, Serbia, and Russia. But territorially speaking, Ukraine will be a landlocked country. I would imagine that from Crimea over to Odessa will be Russia, or independent republics that are effectively Russia, like how Donbass and Lugansk or Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and these operate. So then the questions may be more about the status of parts of Ukraine that are not in the, if you just look at the 2004, I don't know that I have it on me, but it helps to look at it like this. If you will allow me just a second, I can perhaps initiate a brief screen share. Can everyone see this just by a nod? Okay, so this was the 2004 election that was stolen. Viktor Yanukovych won this election. Then Soros and Bush came in and somehow just stole the election, forced a do-over, like what, a do-over. And they had a second election and Yushchenko won. He was poisoned in the interim and became looked like some kind of villain from Batman. They say polonium. But this is basically, you can see in many ways what the areas that are blue would be Russia. Actually, Crimea already is. That's the 81.26, and then the little base there. That's 88.83. You can see 91.24. That's Lugansk. 93.54 is Donetsk. But even Kherson, which is 51%, that's a huge example of what they're thinking, because Kherson at 51% Yanukovych voters, which was kind of a proxy for, we like Russia. Okay, that's what is inferred here, by the way, just to be clear. They're already saying, well, Kherson probably will be a Kherson Republic, or that maybe that's negotiable, but that's 51%. So if you look at all these other 68, 61, 67, 66, that includes Odessa and at 66. Then there's a strip you can't see, like that border, like that border between Moldova is not marked, but to the left of that 66%, like below that 84% in orange, that's Moldova. But on the border there is a miniature little tiny country that's part of Russia effectively already. That's basically a giant military base called Transnistria. Yeah, so they already have that. They can launch operations from there when it comes to the phase 2 or phase 3 of the operation that'll involve taking Odessa region. That's 66.56 on the map. So anyway, the whole blue you can see easily is Russia in some way. Then Ukraine there, what you see is left is already a rump state. I call it the former Ukraine. But then in the far west there, where that 67.45, they have an independence movement. And even though they're related to the Galicians they're related historically to the Galicians, and that's also, the region's also been called Galicia, they call themselves Ruthenians or Rusins or Transcarpathians. And they have said they want to join Russia. They want to be recognized by Russia and join Russia, or be an independent country like Russia, like with Russia, like the way Lugansk and Donetsk or, Abkhazia and Ossetia are. Or they might go fully Russia like Crimea went. So now in the 93 and the 93-74 and 90-71, that's where the Nazi movement started, but it's all throughout the whole country. Because, Azov, which is named after the Sea of Azov, which is below that in the blue zone, that's 71.3, and to the right of 81.26, that's the Azov Sea. And the region where Mariupol is, where Azov had their stronghold, is in that heart of the pro-Russian area. That's why, by the way, we already know that it's disinformation that Russia was engaged with the wanton disregard for civilian life. And that's the strongest proof right there. Like, even if you follow the narrative that Russia would only spare the lives of their own, that's a Russian population in that region. They're not there to kill. Russia didn't go in to kill Russians, even by the logic of the West. Okay, I would propose that they have a disincentive to do any serious damage anywhere against civilians for a lot of reasons. The whole world is looking. They need the Ukrainian rump state to actually be pro-Russian, which they call neutral in the language of Lavrov. So there's many reasons to see, but definitely there's a chance that in the northwest of the country and the west of the country, that that Poland and Hungary both have historical claims on some of these parts, and that could be a deal that's made that might even, Poland is a big focus of Russian foreign policy, and giving them something there, in exchange for getting out of NATO I mean, think about, you see, this is part of this is Ukraine was created out of 2 world wars and didn't really exist. The people who spoke a language that people sometimes called different things, it's very confusing. We won't go down this path because it's too much to untangle, and the words change meanings, like Galicians change meaning, Ruthenian and Rusin has changed meaning. The whole people have been called Ruthenian, even in the, outside of Kiev were called Rusins and Ruthenians, and then they were called Ukrainians. And so these names have shifted around. It's actually requires a whole, 6-month course probably. I'll admit. Oh, you got Ken? Okay. So yeah, that's what it will look like. At the rump state, you can see is what it will look like in one scenario. And I could be wrong about this. I'm just saying what experts in my field are saying and what looks like the case, and based on the demographics and based on what's realistic, where the Army's been operating. You can see where the Army's been operating exactly in this blue zone, with the exception of maybe Sumy, where that 79.45 is, or it might be 71.15, and then yeah, no, I think that's Sumi is there in 79.45. So could be wrong. I'm sorry, my ignorance for the geography of Ukraine. I should know this, but then again, yeah, then the West over there on the far left of the map, that could be even broken up. You might have a different state that's pro-Russian, and other areas might be like openly pro-Russian, and then other areas might be broken off. And these were parts, by the way, what I'm saying is that, like, for example, Lviv was part of Poland in the past. Okay. And so, Polish nationalism is very much behind the government in Poland today, but the expression of that nationalism is anti-Russianism. And yet that could be flipped without undermining. I mean, USAID and Radio Free Europe and Voice of America have invested billions of dollars into the academic and educational military thinking in Poland to build up extreme nationalism, extreme ethno-nationalism, to be clear, as an anti-Russian project. So even though you probably can't undo that strong nationalism, you could redirect it in towards, the idea of Poland, like, you have two visions. We're going to make our nationalism make us into a nuclear impact zone, and we're going to be Operation Get Behind Dark Guy. Or we're going to make our extreme nationalism allow us to pick up territories that we lost in the 20th century. Like, think about that president that would think about the statues that would be built in the centers of every town for that guy, right? And that would be in the direction of peace. So yeah, that's how I would answer that question. Thank you.
That was way more comprehensive than I expected. Thank you, Joaquin. Just to recap here, it's 4:15 on our side of the Atlantic. On your side, it's got to be about 10:15. How are you doing? Are you really okay? Like, no hard stop or anything? Because I've got another 8-9 questions here.
Let's try half of those for now, and I'll
Okay.
give shorter answers, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure thing. All right, Adam, I know you've been waiting for a while.
Yep. Sorry about that. You actually kind of answered a lot of what my question was in your last answer. First of all, would you talk a little bit about the what you called a plutocracy? I've always called it an oligarchy in the Ukraine. And number two is what we're accusing Russia of is what in the United States and its satellites are guilty of. Is that an element of the gargoyle effect?
Okay. Thank you. Can you, the last question, can you reframe the question for me about gargoyle? What gargoyle
Yeah.
effect?
Okay. So yeah, you talked about how the United States is and the media are constantly hammering on Russia as being run by oligarchs. When what the United States is doing in the Ukraine is propping up that same dynamic. In effect, we're doing what we're
Oh,
accusing
yes,
our
yes,
enemy
yes.
of. Is that an element of a gargoyle?
I would more define that as gaslighting or flipping the script. That's more like gaslighting. That's like accusing the person, see, by taking the narrative lead, because they control people's access to information in the mainstream. I don't even think they do anymore. I think people just, this is a different question. I think actually most people are aware of this on a certain level who have any concern about it actually get it. But there are cowards and there are people who have legitimate reasons to be afraid, and then there are just cowards who are being pressured by the strong groupthink and cancel culture that's being promoted. A lot of people have jobs and they have to go on social media and denounce Russia just to keep their job at something unrelated to Russia and geopolitics or government altogether. It's really insane. It kind of like the BLM thing. Like it was like, if you work at Starbucks and you don't have a BLM thing on your, Instagram account, then you get fired from Starbucks. Like, right. So think about how that works with geopolitics and working in any academic institution. You have to be anti-Russian to keep your job, unless you're tenured or, keep it to a minimum. Even that's going away. So that's more just taking a narrative lead, flipping the script, because then if people then hear afterwards that Russia said, no, Russia's been saying that about the US, it just sounds like, well, both countries accuse each other, so the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, or maybe both countries, maybe Russia's just accusing to gaslight, and maybe the US is right. It just depends on your biases, but most people would tend to think, most people, when they see two people fighting, throwing punches, they just think, oh, these guys got into a fight. So, I would put it like, it's more like gaslighting. And then plutocracy versus oligarchy. So a plutocracy specifically, a country ruled by a financial elite, whereas an oligarchy is any power group. So oligarchy is a little bit more general of a term. So in other words, all plutocracies are oligarchical, but not all oligarchies are plutocratic. Yeah, so it's like all stop signs are red, but not all red things are stop signs.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Adam.
Pixel asks, there are some people who blame Trump for what is happening in the Ukraine. How would you respond to this?
Yeah, well, that's a very big question. I would just try to guess at maybe what some of the things are, like the cancellation of weapons treaties that limited that, the U.S. unilaterally ending some of the limitations on weapons that can be used, and things like that. That can be taken both ways, because then Russia gets to back out of those treaties, and then what countries get what countries get the cold water on their face when Russia backs out of those treaties? New Europe, right? Poland, Latvia, Lithuania. So it kind of goes both ways. You really have to think strategically. You don't listen to what Trump says, you look at what Trump does. And when you look at just everything from all of the unanimously from all of the insider think tanks that publish publicly, or even generals and think tank and retired generals who write for op-eds for The Hill or for the Wall Street Journal, New York Times. When you look at even stuff that Rand has put out, when you look at Brookings Institute, when you look at all of them, they all say the same thing, and that was that Trump is a very big danger to NATO, and that there's a reason for that, and there was a reason for the whole Russia collusion hoax in the first place, because even though it's not against the law to reorient U.S. policy, they wanted to make that a crime. So even though collusion, whatever that meant, there was a truth in there, which is that there was an attempt to move away from an institutionalized view towards Russia, not out of some broad humanitarian gesture or whatever, but in some way, yes, because nuclear war is not humanitarian and avoiding nuclear war is humanitarian. and the wastefulness. There's almost an outdated approach to Russia that has been institutionalized, inherited from the British Empire. Really is the main culprit in the thinking about Russia, that the U.S. doesn't even have historical, gripe with Russia. U.S. and Russia were allies in both world wars, in fact. It's really amazing that the anti-Russia rhetoric goes back to, it had nothing to do with communism, because it goes back to the 19th century, and these ideas about core, about the heartland. You have some of the founders of geopolitics thinking at this time, Reich, Mackinder, and so on, and they were probably fixed in some way, but people like E.H. Carr, who understood that that a strong Russia had a stabilizing effect on Europe and the world as it was known at the time, about 100 years ago. So yeah, that's how I would address that. If I missed the question in my explanation, forgive me.
All right, we got a big one from Steve, who writes the following. Jeff Booth wrote a book called The Price of Tomorrow, where he presents the argument that the deflationary nature of advanced technology in the global society is colliding up against the inflationary monetary policy that the global West has used to control the global economy. Do you agree that this type of tension exists? If so, do you think this will work itself out in the division of access to new technologies like life extension, AI, new energy, tech, etc., between the have and the have-nots? Or do you think that a new Renaissance Reformation is possible, where a new monetary policy will emerge and average people will have access to this new technology? That's it. That's a big one. Thank you.
Yeah. So what I like about Jeff Booth is that he was able to present a thesis that had been in the public domain for over 100 years at the time that he put it down. I think maybe 120 years, this idea had already been in the domain. But because of how the world of ideas worked out and how ideas were attached to other ideas, it really couldn't be, explained this way. But it was Karl Marx who explained in Capital that technological advancement had a deflationary effect. Or actually, it's actually not. It's deflationary. It's more disinflationary than deflationary, but deflationary works too. And it's true that technological advances make your dollars go farther, which means that with the same earnings, you can buy a lot more and work a lot less. But only if you have a human-centered system can that truth be realized as the type of renaissance that Booth and actually Karl Marx, in a strange way, if you believe it or not, but the receipts are there, folks, did say these things. That is a possibility. Booth writes much more closer to our present time than Marx. So the ideas in play, though, what I look at and what I've written about is basically that the fourth industrial revolution is actually can go in either direction. And study of the fourth industrial revolution is a very important thing. And maybe this is a little bit of gargoyle, but it's more like hiding in plain sight or making a good thing sound bad. All of the best ideas about where the future could be for humanity are actually contained in the ideas of the fourth industrial revolution, 3D printing, and the Internet of Things. So what they've done, what the World Economic Forum has done, just like with UN Agenda 2030, there's World Economic Forum Agenda 2030. And the two are not the same, except to the extent that the World Economic Forum can influence the individual member states of the UN. Because, and let me just try to answer this two ways, because the Great Reset, Agenda 2030, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, 3D printing, and the Internet of Things are all related, okay? And they're making it look like, they're trying to make it look like, remember Margaret Thatcher, there is no alternative, okay? It's Tina. In other words, technology is coming. You can't stop technology, and technology means these things, and these things are what we say they are. Now, there's, for you thinking logical people, some steps have been made in there, yeah? There's actually a couple steps in there, and they're not true. So, contained in these ideas of the Fourth Industrial Revolution is this idea of automation. Now, of course, the real questions are about human culture. Are we evolutionarily adapted to work in different ways, since, you know, from the level of, you know, amoebas and single-celled bacterias, we work to live and we live to work, and, you know, the whole evolutionary process, etc. I mean, there's that angle too. So that's a philosophical and maybe biological question and a social question that's what we should be looking at once we solve this problem with the plutocracy. But there is absolutely 3D printing. So this is actually this question about deflationary, about how technology is net disinflationary, and that's true. The problem is that for the elites, whose system is based upon planned obsolescence and the upwards accumulation of capital up until the postmodern economy that they've been floating on for 40, 50 years. But prior to when dollars related more to precious metals, let's say, it's not the most precise to think of it in this way, but you know, we have to start somewhere to explain this. That that economics is actually in a postmodern state. So just like you have in the, you know, post-structuralist schools in the critical, in social sciences, we're in the postmodern age in economics, which is notional and very detached from reality. That's what it's, because modern economics is very much based in, well, in layman's terms, sound money theories or policies of sound money. Okay. So the thing, though, is that what we can't get around is that technological developments make us wealthier, which means that we work less. But there's also another thing that we learn from this, is that in this derealization zone of hallucinogenic economics that we've been living in for 2 centuries, okay, they've been saying that the economy is growing, and yet we're going further in debt, and our standard of living is dropping. And it's like the truth is in such plain sight that if the economy was growing, then your spending power would be increasing. Your children's standard of living would be higher than yours. That's the definition of a growing economy. So you don't even have to deconstruct the algebraic equations or, you know, compare Marx with Hayek, and, you know, you don't have to look at von Mises or any of these things. I mean, you should. They're all very interesting. You can learn, but it's very concrete. Are things getting better or things getting worse? Are we getting richer or are we getting poorer? And that's the answer to the question, is the economy growing? And the economy has not been growing. So what that means is that while technological advances have occurred, they have offset that by the upwards distribution of wealth. That's all. That's a political problem. That's a distribution problem, not a technology problem. Technology is not the enemy, right? The enemy are the civilizational crash collision that we have with the plutocracy. So, in summary, Jeff Booth is right. I don't, you know, the way he positions it, you know, you could update it to talk about the Great Reset, as I do. Effectively, these truths have been known about since the, you know, late 19th century. You can automatically you can figure them out from David Ricardo, Adam Smith, John Locke. You can work from there and you can see it's very basic political economy. Yeah.
Yeah, you know what I just find incredible is that in the course of the past, especially 40 years, when you look at a macroeconomics textbook from the 1950s or 60s, it's much more elegant and simple in terms of just very clearly stating what you just said, in the sense that it's obvious that there will be always a necessity to introduce new technologies. I have a high school macroeconomics textbook called Geography and Economy, published in 1945 behind me. If you don't have technological investments and new technologies coming online, you will always hit boundary conditions. That was understood. And if money is not making things better, increasing productivity, making life better for people, then there's something wrong with how you're defining money and wealth.
Right.
That was like common sense.
Right.
And then now, 40 years now into global, or 50 years into globalization, there's an interesting irony that they've overly complexified the idea of economics with quantum mechanics model, like formulas, right? That you have to somehow know if you want to have an opinion about what Greenspan was thinking or what economic value is, to the point that you're told, oh, if you don't have a PhD or several PhDs, you don't have a right to have an opinion, even if your life is obviously getting worse and your country is in more and more debt. It doesn't matter. You're wrong, right, because you don't have that PhD. Now, ironically, while that system abstractly has been getting more complex, people, I think, very lawfully have become more simplistic in passing labels and judgment to, well, what is technology? Is it good or bad? Well, technology causes population growth, which causes overpopulation, which causes the destruction of the environment. Thus, technology is bad. So there's this oversimplification on the one hand as a reaction to the hyper absurd overcomplexity on the other hand, where
right,
basic common sense that a child could understand could follow what you just said. Life, is it getting better or worse? Oh, it's measurably atrophying our infrastructure, everything. And so whatever we've been calling monetary value is got to be wrong if money's been growing and there's been no benefit. Common sense. On that
well
note,
said.
I got a question that I liked from Francesco. I think Francesco speaks to a broader mode of thinking right now, and I think this question is valid based on what we've been saying and what you just described. Francesco asks, do you see a possibility for the issue of climate change to be tackled without global totalitarianism in a way that all countries can go along? Is collaboration without tyranny possible, or some actor will always have some leverage to boycott effectively any cooperative effort? So that's a bit of a loaded question, but I think, again, a lot of people have that same sort of mode of thinking. So
yeah, look, it's a fair question. It's a real question. I like it. UN Agenda 2030 has 17 points, and point 13 addresses global warming, okay, and climate change. Now, there are other points that deal with other impacts of industrial waste and bad development practices that damage the environment. The problem is that in our discourse is that on the one hand, we're talking about global warming, and then over here, we're talking about a lot of the things that might cause global warming that are anthropogenic, that are human caused, and then you have a lot of other practices that damage the environment. We're talking about clean air, clean water, things like this. And all the people who are concerned about things that there's no dispute about, okay, at all. I mean, you might even say, well, they're cranks, whatever, but there's no dispute about water with certain chemicals in them makes you sick, and it's bad to have water like that. Air with these things in it, when you breathe it, it makes you sick. It's not good to have those things in the air. It's very, very simple. The problem is that all those concerns have been swept up into global warming, so that when countries or people or activists want to address things that everyone agrees on, there are actively NGOs hijacking it into a particular way of approaching global warming. There are ways that countries can agree to address these questions, and unfortunately, like with many things, and many of the answers are hidden in plain sight behind a lot of ugliness. So we mentioned, Fourth Industrial Revolution. Well, that's actually, just to tie in those two questions, because it's going to relate to global warming, that's actually not what they say it is. That's actually automation, but being done at a local level, because that it corresponds also to 3D printing, which is local. That actually localizes production and solves many problems related to complex or overextended supply chains, which, by the way, the transport of those things, then is you're expending energy to transport those things. So maybe in some people's concerns that equates to carbon emissions, you see. The transportation of these things in trucks and in big, boats and that ship things, and they dump their fuel, their used fuel and their waste into the oceans, etc. So now, when it comes to human beings living on the planet, however, I think that there is a good possibility, and there is strength in the argument, in fact, that if the Earth were to get a few degrees warmer, that the net effect would increase the habitable zone of the planet in terms of the tropical zone. The areas between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn would grow, which means that the areas that are, tundra would then become more like subtropical, and so on and so forth. So this would actually increase the yield. It actually goes very much along with the terraforming of the Sahara Desert. So the terraforming of the Sahara Desert would probably increase temperature a little bit. I don't know how much, but it would have an impact on temperature. And this confuses people in some way, but actually we are right now in an ice age, and we just happen to be in a little warming period within an ice age, okay? And that warming period includes temperatures that have been a little bit cooler than this, and yet we're still in an ice age. And they talk about the interglacial and so forth. So think about it in terms of that. Human beings on the planet, there are there's debate about to what extent increases in temperature, destabilize, the ocean currents and increase the storms and hurricanes and things like that. That's one issue. But when you look at from the perspective of population control and the fear mongering involved in food scarcity, what we do know is that if the Earth was cooler, that would reduce crop yields, and it would privilege GMOs that were designed in a sort of neo-Lysenkoan concept. And I'm not disagreeing with Lysenko at all. In fact, the idea of epigenetics is fascinating to me personally, and it has actually many liberatory components, but genetically modified foods is a different thing altogether. And what they seem to be doing is trying to adapt GMOs for colder weather so that you get larger yields in colder weather. But of course, the nutrient quality of those foods, you might hit a caloric threshold, but the nutrient value is depleted. And then in addition to that, you have to buy the seeds every year. They don't grow their own seeds. They're terminator seeds. So then the people who own the genetic code effectively own the food supply on a cooler Earth, in which it's difficult for indigenous farmers, not plugged into, like, say, the matrix, if you will, to be able to grow food. So, but when we talk about environmental concerns altogether, certainly it's been the practices of a rapacious plutocracy that have damaged the environment, and I think that the point that you can unite the highest number of people around is in the pre-global warming environmentalism. It really seems that the global warming issue itself is one which, setting aside whether it's true or not, or where it comes from, or how the tests were done, and whether these were biased, just putting that aside, okay, because that is a different thing, which I'm not scientifically adapted or educated to delve into areas outside of my field of knowledge. I can speak to the political and geopolitical and social exploitation of that, and how what appears to me to be universally agreed upon environmental concerns have been sucked up and redefined as global warming, which really takes the wind out of the sails of issues relating to clean air, clean water, and things like this. So that's how I would approach it.
Thank you. And I feel like we're coming to a very late point in today's conversation. You've elevated the thinking and quality of analysis to a very high place. I don't want to, there's so many good questions I don't have time to get at today, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sure that there's a way that people could send you a message of some sort as a personal question, or maybe on your Telegram group. I would just add, I guess, one last question, which is sort of a synthesis, a composite of a few questions that came up, all touching on the sort of idea of, well, okay, what sort of ways of thinking constructively can be done for people in the United States, in Canada, in Ibero-America, Europe, beyond, to help facilitate the defeat of this great reset agenda and broader dark age situation that we see coming online. These are sort of difficult questions when people throw them to me. I find it somewhat challenging sometimes, and a lot of this is subjective, but how would you go about helping people organize their thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure. So the plutocracy, the ruling class, are hiding the answers behind the labels, which the opposition to their agenda finds disgusting. Does that make sense? Maybe I can kind of shorten that. 3D printing, the fourth industrial revolution, and the Internet of Things all have immense human liberatory potential in those technologies. But those labels, they've defined them in a transhumanist, neo-Malthusian, nightmare, apocalyptic, dystopic, post-reality way that thinking people who understand what they mean by these things are turned off by and are fighting against. But by fighting against these things, by the way that they've defined these things, they've already got you boxed in, okay? The Internet of Things is not smart things and everything in your house is plugged in, and or that production is done in such a way where you have like a zero marginal cost or something like this, okay? What they are trying to do, just so you understand, and I'm going to make this be like the answer that lands, I hope. Okay. In the development of human civilization, you can look at two distinct patterns. You can look at in northern Eurasia and northern Europe, where you have a lot of forests and grasslands with a lot of rainfall, okay, and this allowed tribes to flourish with a lot of autonomy because they had rainfall to grow the food, okay? And so then those tribes, maybe if there was a conflict or some problem, these tribes would join together and confederate, okay, to solve military threats. And I'm not saying that they're all good human beings or they didn't go on raiding parties or whatever. We're just talking about freedom indexes within a society, okay? Then you have, for example, the Nile and the Indus River Valley civilization and the civilizations between the Tigris and Euphrates, okay? And these were very different because the military elite could control the waterways, and they can control the waterways so that you had to be in with their system on these new kind of like Babylon and Sumeria, like these societies of scale, like building pyramids and stuff like this, with these overdeveloped priestly castes and these overdeveloped bureaucracies and these very big armies that can shut you off from the water with the flick of a lever. And that's how they maintained control over sharecroppers, and you really couldn't own the land, and you really couldn't own anything, but they built these big state religions of a God on earth being the ruler so that you would be happy. So you would own nothing and be happy. And this is basically called, unfortunately, it's unfortunate because the person who came up with it was an anti-communist Marxist McCarthyite named Carl Wittfogel. And the book is called Oriental Despotism. But this is a despotism that anyone is capable of, I think, is the takeaway. It's not uniquely Oriental. But so what they're trying to actually do is hold back. What the Great Reset is all about is holding back the Fourth Industrial Revolution, holding back 3D printing, holding back the Internet of Things, redefining them, and then putting that on pause. Okay, making you think that's the ugly thing not to look at. Don't go there. Oh no, don't go into the briar patch. Okay, don't. It's like Tar Baby and the Brer Rabbit, and, Zippity Doo Dah. Don't go in the briar patch. Don't go. Don't look at this. It's ugly. We're scaring you. Boo. Fourth Industrial Revolution. 3D printing. Boo. Okay. Then they're not doing that. They're trying to increase the coercive technologies so that the coercive technologies can grow disproportionate to the liberatory technologies, so that by the time the technology exists for 3D printing to eliminate all these supply line issues, all these planned obsolescence, scale production, where, or just-in-time production, where people work these meaningless jobs, turning gears 8 hours a day, and maybe you have a union, it's a little bit better. Probably you don't, it's a lot worse. Whatever, okay? These are the issues that, when you actually look at 3D printing and these things, the answers are in there. They're trying to hold them back, make you think it's not what it is, redefine all these things in the Schwabian dialect, okay? But for the Fourth Industrial Revolution is just called, was just called I 4.0, Industry 4.0, and it was actually introduced at the Hanover World's Fair as a concept in Germany in 2011. Not Klaus Schwab's idea at all. And techies and futurists and stuff have been talking about this concept for even 10 years before that, probably since the end of the 90s. And because very obvious what's on the horizon. And all these people talking about it back then were just layman engineers, just hobbyists and professionals who worked for big companies, and in their spare time were building these late 90s blogs on the internet in the early message forum days, and we're working out actually how these technologies have a liberatory potential. So then how the solution then is that instead of being afraid of these things, to understand what these technologies actually mean, what their potential is, and then to work at the local level. Like, can you imagine the state of Maine or the state of Ohio or Alberta holding an international World's Fair with a $50 million prize to expedite the development of 3D printing, or to expedite the development of these things? These can be handled with just, very affordable prizes with real money. Like $10 million, $50 million is like nothing. They piss that away on, fixing some statue that BLM broke, okay? And instead, they could have that be a grand prize for something that people would actually come together for. But you would have whole teams coming together. 50 people would come together for $1 million a piece on, speeding up implementation of 3D printing and the real 4IR. Okay, then that would actually undo the entire system of this despotism based on controlling you and controlling technology in a very like building dams and building levees type of way that they're trying to do. Yes, that's how I would answer that.
That is fantastic. I love that approach. And it's true. Like, if you think about it, again, common sense, elementary stuff, right? A fire can cook your food or can burn down your neighbor's house.
Yeah, precisely.
Right?
Yeah.
It was a discovery, and it is used, and it can be used for good or for bad. Knife, any tool. And AI, artificial, like computer learning mechanisms, 3D printing, the Internet of Things, as you said, are tools. The question is, what is the intention, the design, the purpose of those who will utilize those tools, and what system, what will be the nature of the rules of that game, and will it be used to enslave or to liberate? Will it be used with wisdom or with folly? And we have been so, I think, just misinformed and conditioned with propaganda over generations within our movies, subtle messaging and Trojan horses within scripts in film and TV and books that have all reamplified the idea that no, technology itself is intrinsically a bad. It is always going to be used to destroy and enslave. And the best we can do is detach, think local, go little, don't avoid technology at all costs, which is the, and it's basically taking the greatest weapon we have to do battle against this enemy and telling us that no, this thing will, it's like you'll get an electric shock if you touch your sword. Just go and fight the lions, but don't touch your sword.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
It's all in the mind. Yeah, it's very
Yes.
good. I love how you said that. And I'm thinking maybe in the future, in the near future, maybe we could do a theme just specifically focusing on the question of the battle of science within this epistemological framework. I think that either a conference or a broader presentation really, really zeroing in on that, and just looking at the chat room, how many people have offered really great links to things like the viral delusion, wonderful scientific.
Yeah, the chat's taken a whole life of its own there. It's
Really?
fantastic. It's beautiful. Yeah, that's great.
Creative evolution going on with the chat room. So yeah, I think we got a lot of ideas to explore there too. So let's talk about that sooner than later, and how this all relates to a synergy with spirituality and God too, right? Because this dichotomy of science versus spirituality is a false dichotomy. There's no reason.
They're trying to take the God part out of the human ingenuity that creates technology, and that is, first of all this ingenuity comes from this divine inspiration and the spark that's in all of us that expresses this stuff into the world. And I mean, that's a whole other ontological question beyond epistemology, but absolutely.
This is
Yes,
great.
Matt, I have a suggestion for the epistemological discussion.
Of course.
Because in cognitive science, there's a notion of the basic cognitive capacities, for example, category formation or pattern recognition, for example, or multiple attentional capacity. And precisely that is the cybernetic, how can I say it, bad orientation, because in those 8 cognitive capacities, they don't take into account the true stuff, which is pure consciousness. They won't talk about attention and spontaneous multiple attentional capacity, but it's a very devious way to dismiss that epistemological evolution having as a main ingredient pure awareness, precisely.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, epistemology, your theory of knowledge.
Exactly, because those people are not idiots. Okay, they will use something resembling pure awareness, attention, and the capacity for simultaneous attentional capacity, making people forget the essential stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And if you read the cognitive sciences papers, it's very impressive, okay? But once again, it's like the new economy. For the layman, it could appear very impressive. It will always put aside the essential stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think we can have a very fun discussion on that.
All right, let's definitely put that on the high priority list. Definitely the for anybody involved in the church communities, I would say launching against the cybernetics heresy might be a fun line of attack.
Yes,
because there was a reason why it was banned from Russia until the day after Stalin died. And that's a whole discussion into itself. But yeah, great, Kwan. Thank you for that that addition to this. And
I even have the title: How to Reduce the Divine Mind to a Robot.
Okay. Are we made in the image of a sociopathic robot or God?
Wow. Yes. And I would say that it would be a good occasion to destroy completely the books by Harari.
Yeah. Ooh, all right. That's a good intro to it.
Very good.
Very good. Joaquin, I know it's late. You've given a lot of yourself, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a very, a very good, mind dump. And, just I hope people upload. So I just wanted to say that You know, all of these things that are happening in the world are survivable. Human beings have been through worse than this, and we will get through this together. The things that they want you to be afraid of are the things that you should look more closely at with an open mind. And the people that they say are your enemies may be your friends, or at least not your enemies. And that's how I would conclude.
Beautiful. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And hopefully we'll see a lot of you guys next week, Sunday. We're going to carry back to our Rising Tide Foundation lecture series with something on Thomas More and the geopolitical realities that he was living through and intervening upon, with a look towards our future. So I'll catch you all, hopefully, or some of you next week, whoever wants to. If you don't get these invites, send us an email to info@risingtidefoundation.net. And thank you again, Joaquin.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joaquin. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
See you guys.
See you.